Now, so what I wanted to do in my research was I wanted to sort of actually look at the lived experience of calling, right? So I mentioned that earlier. My research has to do with exploring the experience of being called and see if I could come up with some maybe themes that ran across different people's stories, and to maybe come up with a meta-narrative, if you will, sort of a prototypical calling experience that we could say sort of fits and sort of resonates with the experience that all of us had. So let me shift gears now a little bit, and let's talk about how I went about doing my research. So when you're doing research like this, you have something that's called a research method. And let me explain my method to you. First of all, my participants. The scope of these pastors' responsibilities, that's their leadership level, range from smaller churches of 100 to mega churches with several thousand members and district and denominational level leadership. I conducted interviews. I did one-on-one, semi-structured, in-depth life story interviews. They were conducted with the pastors with a proven record of leadership ability demonstrated by way of lengthy service and successful service who indicated that they have been called. All right, so again, so because calling is a bit of a subjective thing, right? I had to, ask them, first of all, do you feel like you were called to ministry? Well, yeah, of course I've been called. Duh. You pencil neck, researcher. What do you think here? I got a church of 5,000 people. Do you think I haven't been called? Okay, well, maybe it was kind of obvious, but that was sort of, I had to start there, right? Because that's the phenomenon I'm exploring. So they have to have expressed a call. And moreover, it was important to me that not did they just say that they had one, but that the fruit of their ministry, the sustaining of their life in ministry, the quality of their lives, the level of their leadership would be an external evidence that yes, obviously this person has been called because, what are the chances somebody could do this on their own volition, right? So they had a call on their life. So these were the people that I used to as my exemplars. Now, let me put a little caveat in here, right? They were men, and men may experience and explain things differently than women. I think women will have different barriers and different obstacles and different challenges than men have. And I presented my research before a very well-respected colleague who does similar research with women. And she said, women would have a different story to tell. And I encourage you, if you're interested in finding out more of a female perspective, there's some great kind of in the career literature, more or less, a woman by the name of Alice Eagley has looked at women in leadership and some of the barriers. Now, it's not necessarily a calling perspective, but it is sort of some of the issues that happen sort of in a narrative scope for women who are trying to enact leadership in their lives. And so it has more to do with family responsibilities and kind of intentionally withdrawing from the workforce and things like that. So I want to put that caveat on there because I've had people comment to that to me. So women, as you're going through this, you might say, oh, this is close, but there's other barriers that I perceived in my calling as well. And granted, I do not doubt that that's true for a minute. So anyhow, just that would be perhaps what do you call it? You call it a caveat, you call it a footnote, you call it a disclaimer, right? That my sample were men. Okay, very good. So let's move on. Using narrative analysis to understand identity. Since calling is intrinsic to one's identity, theories of identity in general and narrative identity in particular are useful means at getting at the phenomenological experience of being called. Sarban proposed what he calls the narratory principle, the idea that human beings think, perceive, imagine, interact, and make moral choices according to narrative structure. Ricoeur argues that the self only comes into being in the process of telling a life story. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, this idea of calling and identity being intertwined through a narrative understanding, right? So this idea that our understanding of ourself and who we are really is a byproduct of when we think about our story, those things that have happened to us, those benchmarks, those incidents, those critical incidents, right? Those traumas, those seasons, those turning points, the narrative, the complexity of a narrative, right? This happened and then this happened, right? Some of our lives might be kind of a comedy and we can't seem to find reality, right? Some of our life stories is more like a tragedy. Some of our life story is what they call a romance, which is really sort of an exploration. It's not romance in the sense that the guy gets the girl, although that typically happens, but the sense that we're off on a great adventure and we're seeking to find something and to right some wrong, right? We're going on an adventure, right? Okay, so some of our lives sort of take on these classic narrative approaches, but maybe we can even see elements of all those things in our lives, right? Sometimes it's a comedy, and sometimes it's a drama, and sometimes it's a tragedy, right? So I looked at this whole idea through the lens of narrative to explore, to look at people's lives as a story. And let me explain now how I went about doing that. The first thing I had to do was come up with an interview protocol. And so the first question I asked was for them to divide their life into a series of chapters and give a ministry career history. Second question had to do with key events. What were the critical or significant episodes, turning points, epiphanies, etc. from each chapter in their stories? Third question had to do with significant people, particularly people who intersect with their sense of calling. The fourth question had to do with the future script, their plans, goals, aspirations, hopes, and dreams for the future that relate to one's ministry. And the last question was a life theme, a message or idea that ran throughout the entirety of their narrative as previously described. Now, it was noticeable that most self-described life themes had little resemblance to the previous stories. And I found this very interesting. They would tell me this story with all these, complexities and traumas and trials and, yada, yada, yada. But then their life theme would be like something completely out of the blue, So anyhow, it's amazing, the human's ability to sort of mythologize and rationalize and sort of pull ourselves out of our own reality, so to speak. So I'm not putting any of these men down. I think we all probably do that. But, one of the great things about this research approach really is when you say, tell me your life story, you're asking for specific events and sort of those things. You're not asking for them to come up with sort of a rational, description. All right, well, tell me about your calling. Tell me about, give me the strengths, if you will, of your life, but really give me the details, right? And so when you ask somebody to do that, you're going to get a lot of interesting things, right? And then you can sort of look at it as a totality and come up with a perspective that you're not going to get if you just say, well, give me the 5 things you believe about calling, right? So if you say somebody, well, give me your theology of calling, give me what you believe, it may not necessarily be the same thing as their experience. And you guys will have an opportunity to explore that in a little bit as well. Let's move ahead. Okay, so what were the results of my research? Well, the first thing I came up with were what were called individual level themes. Since everyone has a different story, it's not surprising that each story seemed to revolve around certain themes unique to the individual. In each individual case, a specific issue presented itself and recurred throughout the story in a theme and variation pattern. And what were some of these themes? Well, here were some examples of these individual level themes. Reconciliation with my father, finding someone to trust, breaking away from my mother, changing gangs, I'm an outcast with no friends, am I a musician or a pastor, letting go of career aspirations. Okay, so you'll see that when I looked at the stories, when I looked at these narratives, I saw that there was sort of one kind of thing that was woven throughout, kind of this, theme and variation pattern, right? So you sort of see this theme and variation that sort of ran throughout all the different eras. And this kind of makes sense when you think about it. Typically we have kind of a life theme and it's not even articulated, right? So for example, the pastor that said, am I a musician or a pastor? Well, he wouldn't really articulate it like that, right? But as I listened to his whole life, I kind of realized that was a major theme of his life story. Or for example, finding someone to trust, right? Now, if I said, tell me your life story, or tell me the guiding theme of your life, that probably wouldn't have been the first thing that came to him. But as I listened through all these different eras, I said, this guy was always looking for somebody to trust in his life, right? Maybe he had trust issues, I don't know. But that became a theme of his story.